The next speaker is Brittany Pousett. Brittany is the research prosthetist at Barber Prosthetics. She has a bachelor in biophysics from UBC. She's a graduate of the BCIT program and has a master's in science from McMaster, specializing in rehab science. She's been working very hard for the last 18 months with us doing research, and she's going to comment on that now. Brittany?
Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about clinical data collection. We're going to set the stage for our journey for a little bit and then talk about some of the obstacles that there are to clinical data collection and how we can overcome them. Then I'm going to go through 5 measurement tools that can help you in your clinical data collection, and then talk about what to do with the data and why. So first of all, I think we just need to define clinical data collection. This is a huge topic, and I could talk about many different things under this same title. So when we look at our patient care evaluation, there's different areas that we're collecting data in. Today we're going to focus on the outcomes. So what is an outcome? So here's just a simple definition of an outcome measure, just to make sure that we're all on the same page and understanding what we're talking about. So it's a tool, qualitative or quantitative, that can assess a patient and their treatment and provide you with a score that can then be compared to normative data or to that patient at a different point in time. So there's lots of definitions of outcome measures out there. For today, this is what we're talking about. So now I'm going to have a couple of polls to ask you. There we go. So first of all, how familiar with outcome measures are you? Just to get a bit of an idea of where the audience is at. Sort of pretty solid, somewhat familiar with outcome measures, which is good. Some people very familiar. And then the second question we have is, how often do you use these outcome measures in your clinical practice? So we've got never, infrequently, monthly, or weekly. Okay, so we're fairly split here. So about half of us infrequently use outcome measures, and the other half of us, well, a quarter of us use them weekly, and then another quarter of us use them never. So we've got kind of a wide spectrum here, which is good, because that means that there's lots of that you can take away from the presentation today, hopefully. So we'll go back to our PowerPoint here and continue on. Maybe. Hey, there we go. Okay, so let's talk about the global trends in outcome measures. Outcome measures are being regularly used in other fields, in other healthcare professionals, such as by physios and OTs. And in the US, as we heard this morning, reimbursement is beginning to be tied to the documentation of outcome measures. So as Paul was mentioning, being able to prove the value in the treatment that you're providing is going to come back and influence how you get paid for that. In Canada, we're not there yet. However, the practice analysis survey was done a couple years ago, and it shows that this is an area we need to address. So we look at the frequency rating of how often we do this, and it kind of relates to today, is that majority of people, of certifies in Canada, rated as doing things with outcome measures as doing them rarely or occasionally, so monthly to quarterly. It's about reflective of the room. But then when you look at how critical it is, we rated it as being around moderately critical. So we're saying this is something that is moderately critical to our practice and how we see our patients, and yet we're not doing it actually that often based on how critical we're saying that it is. Then later in the survey, when asked the open-ended responses, it was commented to be one of the main responsibilities that will increase in the future is the use of outcome measures. So, why do we even measure things anyways? There's a lot of reasons for it: developing evidence-based practice, measuring patient progress, justifying treatment costs, achieving goals, predicting a future event. But overall, I'd like to make an argument for the fact that it improves patient care, that we use outcome measures for our patients, not for ourselves. And this will kind of be flowing towards my whole presentation today. So what stops us from measuring things? Most people report time, resources, maybe education, maybe not having tools, or maybe just not knowing what to do with the data. So what we're going to do today is talk about how to overcome some of these barriers. First of all, how do we overcome the obstacles? The number one thing that I've kind of recently stumbled upon is that we need to encourage the strength we have in our profession. So according to some very briefly run kind of calculated stats, I think there are around 60 people in our profession in Canada who have completed the master's in the last 4 years. So these are 60 individuals who have completed a master's specializing in evidence-based practice, measurement in practice, and how we make decisions regarding those two things. So I think our field is actually fairly well set up to delve into the topic of evidence-based practice and outcome measures. We have the expertise growing within ourselves. Next, we need to learn from people already doing it. There are people who are using outcome measures. We need to learn from them so that we don't have to go through the same path. And I really like Sylvia's image she had earlier of the arrow that then kind of went 1,000 different ways and then pointed straight. That's kind of what the journey of using outcome measures is like. And if you can save yourself that squiggle in the middle, do it. And finally, let's use the tools available to us. So what's available to us? Well, we have the classic outcome measures. We have observable tests. So the patient does a test, and you score it. We watch them do it, and we fill out a standardized scoring form based on it. You also have self-report surveys, where the patient fills out a survey, or maybe you ask them the questions and they give you the responses and you write it down for them. So what do these tests measure? They can measure things like walking speed, the tug test or the 2-minute walk test. They can measure balance, functionality in specific tasks, quality of life, comfort, satisfaction, all sorts of different things. Now I'm going to give you some examples of these. Now, first of all, I just want to clarify, and little disclaimer, I'm a certified prosthetist. I work in a prosthetics clinic. All of my examples happen to do with prosthetics. I will try and make it as relevant to orthotics as I possibly can. And I think that most of the examples can translate very easily, but just if you're wondering why they're all prosthetics, that's why. So the 2-minute walk test. All you need to do is the 2-minute walk test is a flat surface and a stopwatch and a meter stick where you can portion out how long your walkway is. Very simple. We can probably all find a walkway of some sort. If we can't find one that's long enough for the 2-minute, we can choose a shorter walking speed test. And it's been tested on a variety of populations. And there's information available on how to interpret it. So for people with lower extremity amputations, the mean score for people has been found to be approximately 111 meters in 2 minutes. They've also found that a change over 34 meters is significant, and that values below 130 meters are highly associated with functional limitation in life. And so what do we do with this data? So now we have it. We have somebody that does a 2-minute walk test. Now what? Well, we found that the power of knowing the normative value is actually huge. So when patients are in their initial rehab, they've just been fit with their first prosthesis, they're 2 weeks in, we do their first data collection, and they walk, I don't know, say 40 meters, 35 meters, somewhere around there. And then we come back a couple weeks later and they do the test again. And now they've scored 120. And they know that that threshold of the normal is 111 because we've told them. And now they realize in the first month, they've passed the threshold of normal. The satisfaction and encouragement that people feel is huge. We've actually had several patients start crying when we've told them how their values compare to the normative, because they say, I've put in so much work and someone's recognizing it. Someone's telling me, yes, I am doing good. I am working. All my hard work is paying off. There's also interpretation for people with other pathologies, such as stroke or MS, where they have mean scores that have been reported, as well as how much change there needs to be to have a significant difference from an intervention or rehab over time. So next we have computerized surveys. So this is where a patient fills out a survey electronically. Now, This is where outcome measures started getting a lot better for me. So we started using 5 outcome measures in practice. I can administer 5 outcome measures in under 10 minutes. So it depends mostly on the patient and kind of how they communicate and how independent they are in being able to do the tests themselves versus needing my help. If they're independent, it's under 5 minutes. If they're not independent, it's probably more around 10. However, scoring and interpreting these measures took me over 15 minutes per patient, which was not doable. I mean, we did it, but it was very difficult. It was very frustrating. You'd end up with a pile of outcome measures on your desk, and you know that you'd have to spend the whole day sorting through them all and scoring it. Not useful at all. Computerized surveys allow you to score your results and interpret them instantly. You do the survey, right in the computer, bam, the results are right there. How to interpret it's right there. It's beautiful. If you're going to use outcome measures, figure out a way to use them electronically. It will save you so much time. So an example of this is the +M. This is a measure that Brian was talking about earlier. We use the 12-item one. So there's 12 questions. It asks, how difficult is it for you to complete these tasks? And the patient can mark it off, or they can do it electronically. Now, the beautiful thing about the +M is that you can interpret it really easily. So you get your score, which is your first column. You've just added up their answers over here. So you've got the 5 to 1. You just add them up. Then you have your raw score. Now, when they developed the +M, they ran a whole bunch of people through the measure, and then they figured out what percentile each score was. So if you scored the very bottom of everyone who's ever done the test, you're in like the 0.2 percentile. Okay, and if you score the very, very high end of everyone who's ever done the test, you're in the 99th or 98th percentile. So when you do the test, you can just take your score and put it right into the percentile, and you can tell someone instantly where they fall compared to the normative population of people with lower extremity amputations who did this survey. So instant interpretation. And that's something that patients can understand really easily. You can also do it electronically. So you do it in the computer, and bam, it prints out for you your T-score, your standardized error, and the percentile that it falls in. Now, if you want to get faster, you can use computerized adaptive testing, which is where they actually change the questions based on your responses to previous questions to try and more accurately determine where you fall and take out the amount of questions you have to answer. So in this one, it doesn't actually tell, but it tells you the minimum number is 4, the maximum number is 12, and as soon as you have an error of 3, it will stop you. And again, it gives you your T-score and your error. So then we run into video-assisted analyses. So this provides really valuable information that you cannot see by eye. It also enables us to measure things that are previously only observable, such as step length, angles, and symmetry. And we can compare video from one time point to another time point, or from one plane to another plane. So an example of this is P&O Data Solutions. So you can take a video on an iPad or an iPhone, you can sync it automatically with your online account, and then you can really easily share it and discuss it and analyze it. So there's internal, you can do it yourself, or you can have a third party analyze it for you using standardized scores. So the prosthetic observational gait scale for prosthetics, or the Edinburgh visual gait scale for orthotics. And these are scales that give you scores based on your gait. So now gait analysis can be put into a number score that you can track over time and graph over time and do all kinds of things with it. Let's give you some examples. This is one of the beautiful features of this technology that we've been experimenting with, is that you can take a video, you can draw the video, you can measure on the video, you can take step length, you can take angles, you can do whatever you want. Then you can take screenshots, then you can save those screenshots and send them to other people that you work with. So you want the doctor you're working with to take a look at your patient on the new knee. You want the physio that you're working with to see how their gait has changed or how something needs to be addressed. And you can discuss back and forth using the online communication tools. It's all kept safe and secure, and you can comment super easily. And I've had a lot of success with doctors being actually fairly willing to look at to video and comment back and forth about what they're seeing. The other thing you can do, as I mentioned, is do the scales. So you can go through, you can do it yourself. It actually leads you through. So for each kind of deviation it looks at, you get a score 0 if there's no deviation, 1 or 2, depending on the severity of that deviation. And it goes through and it just tells you what to look at and how to measure it. And you just look at it and measure it and click the right button. And then at the end of it, you get this beautiful report printed off that has pictures and measurements and your scale, your score at the end. You can also send it in and people will do it for you, so you don't actually have to do it yourself. You can sit there, just push go, comes back, your beautiful report. And they also add in things from the literature and research about the significance of the deviations that they've found in your patient's gait, which I found to be very, very useful. So here's an example of a patient. So we did a pre-post comparison. So this guy is a very short transfemoral, or has a very short transfemoral amputation. He came in, we ran him through the POGs, and these are all the gait deviations that were present in his gait before he got a new prosthesis. So this is on his old prosthesis that wasn't working very well for him. We fit him with a new prosthesis, went through it all. A couple months later, we have the definitive prosthesis. Everything's been sorted out. And this is what happened, is we managed to get rid of 3 of the gait deviations by changing his socket. So lateral trunk lean, reduced peak knee flexion and swing, and asymmetrical step length were all solved. So with the new socket, he walked with a much more symmetrical step length and a lot less lateral trunk lean. Some of the other deviations he still had. He still vaults in stance. He still has a slight whip. He still has external rotation at initial contact. But he's also been using a prosthesis for a very long time. And these are things that we would expect, that vaulting in stance is a hard one to take out. And if we really coach him on it, he doesn't have to vault in stance. He can stop himself from vaulting in stance. But if he's left to just walk naturally, he does it. And so this just reflects that through our prosthesis and the new socket, we were able to reduce these 3 things. So now, instead of saying, we gave him a new socket, his gait looks better, check. Now we can say, his score went from being a 12 out of 32 to a 9 out of 32, and these are the 3 specific deviations that we addressed. Much more scientific, much more well documented on what change we actually did. So here's another type of measurement tool, activity monitors. Activity monitors measures how many steps somebody takes per minute. You put it on the patient, you see how many steps they take per day. You can also see their pattern of wear, how often they use it or don't use it, such like that. It's extremely useful for matching subjective feedback with objective feedback. So many times, this technology has transformed and changed dramatically how we've been treating our patients. So a couple months ago now, a lady came in just talking about how she can't do anything anymore. She can hardly walk, she doesn't get to go anywhere, she's stuck inside her house. It's just this incredibly sad story of just how limited her life had become. So we look at her stopwatch. Well, we had the stopwatch on her. We look at her activity monitor, and we found that she actually took around 6,000 to 7,000 steps per day. I don't know if any of you have a Fitbit or a Misfit or something and have tried to take that many steps a day, but you don't get 6,000 to 7,000 steps a day from walking just inside your house to the bathroom and kitchen and back. Like, you have to actually do some serious walking. And so we were able to redirection our care and say, you know what, it's not that bad. Like, you're actually kind of, your perception of how much you can walk and how much you're actually walking doesn't line up. So instead of focusing on, okay, initially our conversation was, well, let's work on walking to the end of your driveway and back. That's a good goal. Then after looking at the data, we realized, no, that's not a good goal at all. You're already doing way more than that. So we need to set our goals appropriate for what you're already doing. So there's some examples of this, the stopwatch, Fitbit, Misfit, cell phones. There's lots of ways of doing it. Some are more expensive than others, but there's something that's very accessible for everybody. So here's an example of the stopwatch, which is the tool that I use the most frequently. So here you have a graph. So along your x-axis, you have hours throughout the day. So from midnight to midnight. Each block of blue is a day, and your y-axis is how many steps they took a minute. So if you see a black bar, that's how many steps they took in that minute of the day. The taller the black bars, the more steps they took. The wider the bars, the longer they walked for. So this is an example of a lady fit with her very first prosthesis, first step recorded by the stepwatch. This is the first 3 days of her rehab ever. You can see that she's taking, I don't know, probably a couple hundred steps a day. It's really small, hard to read, but I think it's like 300 to 400 steps a day. This is her 2 weeks later. So you can see from this, she's now keeping her activity sustained for a longer period of time at a much higher level. I would guess that these are the times where she's at physio, those set times in the day where she's using her prosthesis. And then you can start to see that she's dabbling with using it kind of in the evenings and in kind of later in the afternoon. So she was an inpatient, so she went to her physio in the morning, and then in the afternoon she was allowed to wear her prosthesis around the floor. So here we have her 3 weeks later from that. So what can you tell me from looking at this graph? Does anything stick out to you about what's changed from the previous 2 weeks or 3 weeks? I can't hear you, actually. I can hear murmurs, though. She's using it all day. Yep. What else can you tell me? Yep, so she's walking, she has some times where she wears it for a short period of time or walks slower, less steps per minute, sometimes where she sustains that. She has some times that are wider than others. She has some times where she wears it in the middle of the night. So you can, I don't know if you can see my mouse. No, you can't see my mouse. But you can see on this side of the screen where she's wearing it around 2, 3 in the morning. Perhaps she went to bed and got up to go to the bathroom or something. So we can start to see how she's wearing her prosthesis. Does she take it off? Are there breaks in her day? Are there not breaks in her day? And so we use this for several ways. One, as I said, kind of reaffirming and redirecting our patient care and how we do that. It also cues us often to ask the right questions. So I had a gentleman come in with his check socket, and he came in to get it poured up for a lamination. And I said, okay, how's it been going? He's like, oh, it's been perfect. It's great. It wouldn't change anything. No problems. I said, great, I'm just going to pull up your stepwatch data here, download it, it's routine time. And I go, oh, I noticed that you didn't wear it for 9 days. And he goes, look, and that 9 days stopped 2 days ago. So you've been wearing it for 2 days, and before that there were 9 days when you didn't wear it. It's like, oh yeah, I had like a hole in the back of my leg, and it didn't look very good, so I took it off for a week, and I just used crutches, and then I put it back on, and now I'm here, and it's great. It's like, whoa, like, how did this escape our conversation? Like, this is something we need to address, but something that patients sometimes just forget to bring up, or they don't think about it. They've been wearing their prosthesis every day, all day for so long that the fact that they didn't wear it for a couple of days is, maybe it's normal. Maybe that happens every month or two. So this allows us to and redirects us to ask the right questions at the right time. It also is really reaffirming. So for this lady in particular, in the last week of her rehab in the hospital, she did 12,000 steps. Pretty good for being a month and a half into her rehab. So that's very reaffirming for her. She actually got a Misfit, another activity track, to take home with her so that she could tell me how many steps a day she was taking, and more importantly for her, tell her husband how many steps a day she was taking, and kind of show him that she was still working really hard and doing her work. Okay, so one more tool here is temporal spatial tools. So we can use various pieces of technology to quantify variables that we are interested in that usually can't be quantified. And these tools are objective in that I don't influence them, I don't score them, I don't do anything with them. I set them up, I push go, I stand back, everything happens, I push stop, the report is there. I don't influence what happens in that report very much at all. And it allows us to measure things such as symmetry, step length, that sort of thing. So one example of this is the BTS G-Walk. Essentially, the idea behind this is that they took a gait lab and they tried to condense it down to a key fob, which you then wear on your belt. So it does do a lot of things. You get temporal spatial parameters, step length, stride length, swing and stance durations, single and double limb support. You also get pelvic motions. You obviously miss a bunch of things because We can't do all the angles from just a belt on your pelvis, but we found it to be very beneficial. So here's another example for you. And let's see, can anybody tell me anything from looking at this data, anything about this patient? So you can see the first column tells you what it's measuring, the second column tells you the value, and then 2 columns over tells you the normative range for people. And this is without wearing a prosthesis. So the normative value is, at least. So just take a quick look at these numbers and tell me if anything sticks out to you. So let's start with something easy. What about cadence? She's walking a little bit slower than normal, okay? But what about stride length? Pretty good. She's right in the average, exactly. Now, what happens when we look at her step length right to left? So you can see that's below the next blue bar. We said it's fairly symmetrical from right to left. But what we see the difference in here is the stance phase duration. So she spends more time on her left leg than she does on her right leg, and more time in swing on her left leg than she does her right leg, and more time in double support, although it's fairly similar on her right leg. So we can start picking out things about the patient from looking at this. So I can tell you that she has a right transtibial amputation, which makes sense if you look at this data and can see that she's spending a lot more time, or somewhat more time, on her left leg than she is on her right leg. So this happens to be the same lady that was in the previous stepwatch data around the time of being discharged from the hospital. So she was about a month and a half post her amputation. And now we use this tool in a lot of different ways. So we can use it to give feedback. People love knowing that they're walking symmetrically. And if they're not, they'd love to know why and how to work on that. We've used it to look at gait aids and which gait aids are appropriate for a patient, and look at, okay, how do you walk with 2 canes, with 1 cane, with no cane? Can we make recommendations based on what you can use from a data point of view? Take our subjective out of it completely. We've used it to measure different feet. If we do foot trials, can we find that one foot provides you with a much more symmetrical gait than another foot? And maybe we can, maybe we can't. It's kind of still up for discussion, but it's something we can do. We can cue patients and they can set their goals, they can work on it, and they can get feedback as to whether or not they're doing it that is completely objective. It's not me telling them they're doing good. It's not the physio telling them they're doing good. It's a computer telling them they're doing good. And sometimes it's very powerful because patients sometimes think that we are just being nice. We're telling them that they're doing so well. But when we can do it objectively, where we have nothing to do with it, sometimes that feedback means something different to them. So what do we do with all of this data? So if I have learned one thing in using outcome measures, it's that our patients need to know what their data says. If we're doing outcome measures and writing it in a file and it's just for our own good, it's completely useless, or almost completely useless. The value to our patients and the value to our patient care comes with explaining the data to them, letting them interact with it, letting them know what they're doing, what they're not doing, where they're at, how they're doing it. That is what I've found to be the biggest point of using outcome measures. So with that, we have to figure out a way what to do with the data. We need to be able to give it back to them in a manner that is fast, that's time efficient, and that's also useful and has interpretability built into it. So that brings us to electronic medical records. I don't think you can do this with a pen and paper. I've tried to do it in Excel, and it's really time consuming and extremely painful and just not very user-friendly at all. But with electronic medical records that are actually made for this purpose, it makes it very simple. So one example is OP. So you choose the appointment type. So you choose, say, initial evaluation. Then you pull up a form that is based on outcome measures, and you put your outcome measure right into that form. And then you push save, and it goes. And then you can query it whenever you want, however you want. So you can query things such as the same lady's report, her ABC plus M and 2-minute walk test score throughout her whole rehab journey and beyond. So we have 2-week diagnostic, discharged from the hospital, and then she's had 2 new sockets and definitive sockets since then, so at initial eval for the new socket and at the definitive delivery. So this graph you can spit out in about 3 minutes. If you want to make it pretty, your first time doing it will probably take you more like half an hour. But once you do it once, you can do this for any patient, anytime, in less than 3 minutes. So then you can give it to the patient. You can say, look how you've improved over time. Look at how your plus M score has been constantly improving since 2 weeks out from using your prosthesis, or from discharge actually, of using your prosthesis. And it's not on there for her 2 week because she couldn't actually do enough of the items to feel confident answering that she could do them. And so that's why there's no score for that one. We say, look at your 2-minute walk test score, how it's been improving. Look at your ABC score. We look at your 2-minute walk test score. Why was it so much higher at discharge than it is now? We can start asking questions about this. So I have 2 hypotheses for this one. One is our walkway has turns in it. So we have an 8 to 9 meter walkway that people walk back and forth on and turn. The walkway at the hospital was a track. So there was no turning. So chances are it could have been just due to the fact that we waste time in our 2-minute walk test by turning. But it also could be that in the hospital, she was having physio twice a day, every day, for an hour or 2. Whereas she went home about a month and a half after her amputation, never went to physio again. She went home and went back to work the next day, full time. No more paying attention to her prosthesis or her rehab. And so maybe this is because she's not working on it. She's just kind of going on. So we had a conversation about that. Maybe there's some benefit of going back to physio and working on your gait more. And then we can pull all of our data really easily into one place. So this is the ABC scores for everyone that we fit with a prosthesis, with someone with an existing amputation who got a new socket between roughly October and May this year. Again, we can pull out these numbers in about 5 minutes, maybe. A couple more minutes if you want to make it pretty and do some other things. But once you do it once, the next time, 5 minutes, and you have yourself a graph of every plus M or ABC or 2-minute walk test score, whatever outcome measure you use, instantly in a graph. Now, if I do this, and if you do this, and if we track our data the same way and store it in something that we can export it the same way, knowing maybe the time of their time in their care, their age, their level of amputation, then all of a sudden we can put all this data together and make huge statements about how to interpret outcome measures. What's the normal ABC score for a person in Canada who has a transtibal amputation? We have no idea. But if we all did this, or if a couple of clinics did this for 1 year and pooled all the data together, we'd be able to get studies with numbers in the hundreds rather than 20 here, 20 there. So this is something that is very doable and very easy when you're using electronic ways to keep track of your data. So what do we do with our outcomes once we have them? So we use them in the case of the gentleman who I talked about earlier, who we told him how his 2-minute walk test score related to the norm, and he started crying, and he was so touched about his improvement and where he's come. And that's not an isolated case. That's happened time and time again. People are saying how important it is to them. They're asking to have outcome measures done more frequently. They're saying, can you give me that graph? Can I give it to my sister? Can I put it places? This is so meaningful. We also have those people who are super competitive, who say, I'm doing it again. I'm bringing my running shoes next time. I'm jogging. I've got this. Sometimes, it's funny. And we laugh when people come in and run our 2-minute walk test and are completely exhausted by a minute and a half in and cannot go any further because they've way overrun themselves. But we also have people, I had a girl a couple weeks ago who was going through chemo, who saw no point in doing her physio exercises really. She's like, come on, do I really need to do this? I need to lie here and move my leg around? I don't think so. Then she did the amputee mobility predictor. And she found out that there was one item that she couldn't score perfect on. What do you think she's been doing for the last 2 weeks? She's been practicing standing on one foot for 30 seconds for the last 2 weeks, because every time I see her, she tells me she's ready to do it again. And that's not an isolated case either. This happens over and over and over again. So what do we do? Using outcome measures in practice is easy. There are challenges, but we can overcome them. People in our profession, in our country, have overcome them, and it's very doable. It's something that you can do in, say, 5 minutes, 2 or 3 times in someone's entire treatment over several months. And it improves patient care. Patients are responding, they're loving it, they're asking for more outcome measures, and we're feeling like we're providing them better care based on where they actually are at, based on objective things, not just what we're subjectively seeing. So I encourage you, this week there are so many talks on outcome measures and different talks on different topics that have outcome measures worked into them. A lot of the people talking today and on the panels today are giving some of those talks. So go check them out and find one way that you can incorporate an outcome measure into your practice. Some are very simple, some are a lot more complicated. So choose one that works for you, find something this week, and I encourage you to stick to it. Go home and put it into practice and see how your patients' lives are transformed because of it. Thank you. So now I'm going to invite up our panel for this session, which is Brian Hafner again, Jason Highsmith again, and Kara. And while they make their way up here, I'm going to start off the questions. And you guys can all pull out your apps again and start sending in questions, or stand up and go to the microphones and ask your questions there. My first question for the panel today, or my kind of only question for the panel, is this is a panel that's fairly invested in clinical data collection, and I'm very curious to know what motivated them to get involved in the first place. So if you guys want.
I guess I'll start.
Sure.
Well, so in my career, I started as a physical therapist, and part of entry-level PT training is indoctrination into outcomes. And then when I started practicing, thou shall do outcome measures, and that's the way it is. And because that was early on linked very much to your reimbursement and all that stuff, and so we got it in that side of the house. And then moving into P&O, it was fairly obvious that there was a need there, and then my career evolved into more of a research direction, and it's an obvious thing there. In recent years, in my new role with the Center of Excellence that I'm with, I'm the Deputy Chief of Research and Surveillance, and so it's all about outcome measures. And so we do outcome measures, I mean, you name it, and we're doing outcome measures on it. Everything from productivity of our researchers, we're doing outcomes on them, by the way, all the way to clinical outcomes on a local per patient basis. And so we do a battery of outcome measures on all of our veteran patients, and we do for instance, just to name a few, we do the 2-minute walk test, we do the L test, we do 2 pain questions, and recently there's a national guideline from the VA that says that we will do step activity monitoring. And frankly, when we got that, we said, we don't like the step activity monitor report, so we forced them to change it. And I have that. I can show that if there's time at some point. But we have the new step activity report as well. So it's part of our life now. So.
So my disclaimer is that I am the director and owner of P&O Data Solutions. It's a video gate analysis software. But my disclaimer is that I am passionate about using video because I had a very profound moment that I used video to aid in a decision that I needed to make. So a patient wanted to pay cash for a microprocessor knee, and I was to provide my opinion or recommendation about whether he needed or should have this device. And I questioned what data I had to make that recommendation. And so I used video in this patient fitting, and I walked away from that going, there's no difference. You know, I've been in the profession now for 18 years, but at the time this was like 15, and thought that my gait assessment visually was just fine. But then I went back and I looked at the videos and I had data. I went through the POGs and then I had data and I had a decision and I had a recommendation to show him. And even if it was somewhat opinion-based, because we can't take that away, of course, I had data to back up my opinion. And so I started my company to help practitioners provide data using video. And so recently, Fatoni and Stein did a research article about using 2D video analysis. And I urge you to read it because I think it is one way that the practitioners in this room and anywhere around the world can actually provide data to researchers. If it's done in the appropriate way, the researcher can then take your videos and use it for data to help our profession.
Yeah, I guess as a disclaimer, I'm the lead developer of the research team that put together the PlusM that was mentioned as part of the last study, and I'll be talking about that with some of our other talks this week. But I guess my interest in outcome measures came about primarily because I was really interested in different prosthetic technologies. My career has really been focused on understanding the benefits and limitations to different types of prosthetic interventions, prosthetic feet, microprocessor knees, things like that. And I was always, I guess, amazed at the verbal response that you would get from patients about their experience, and the fact that many of the outcome measures that we had to use at the time really didn't tell us the same story, that there was, either contradiction or it didn't seem to pan out, that the benefits that we heard from our patients were really those that were being shown by the data. So about 7 or 8 years ago now, I guess, NIH, our National Institutes of Health, came out with a request for applications focused on developing better outcome measures. And it just so happened that I have a number of colleagues at my institution that have developed measures for other patient populations, non-OMP populations. And it kind of became a collaboration. I never really thought I'd become an instrument developer, but it was kind of a match made in heaven. And honestly, I've loved the entire experience and have just enjoyed developing, learning about the psychometric properties, how to develop a good measure, and how to make it useful and ideally useful to you all in clinical practice. So we'll see, time will tell, I guess. But it's been a long journey, but a really interesting one. And I have learned more about our own measure and the other measures that are out there in the last 5 years than I could possibly share in the few minutes that we have here. But happy to talk at any time.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have some really interesting questions here. I'm gonna go with the middle one first. So, what value is a 2-minute walk test to a worker who has returned to work full time? Well, I find this very interesting. Oh, it moved. So what I found is there's a couple of different things. So maybe someone has returned to work full time, but they're still walking very slowly. And maybe that's stopping them from doing certain things at their work that they wish they could do. Maybe it's a simple, I have one patient who is returned to work full time, and she can do her job no problem, but getting from the bus stop to her office is the biggest challenge of returning to work. It actually has nothing to do with her workplace, but it's how she gets to her workplace, which is where her gait speed and her gait endurance come into it. But I'm curious if you guys have any other.
Yeah, sure. We recently had a veteran in our clinic that very sedentary, very overweight, and just very low functioning, and low motivated, frankly. And the one thing that this person was interested in doing is some type of aquatic therapy. And so we do that battery of assessments that I've mentioned on all of our patients, including the 2-minute walk test. And as you might imagine, this veteran did not actually walk very far. And so we made a goal just basically to figure out the distance to pools that this person would access. And we went from step counting and 2-minute walk distances commensurate with goals around accessing pools for this aquatic therapy goal. Mm-hmm. So just kind of coming back to your point, I would say it's all goal driven on the part of the patient. And if the patient doesn't have value in it, you probably need to rethink it. So.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I guess I would add was, rehabmeasures.org is a great site to just make sure that you're picking the right measure for the right person. There's one question up here about give me a recipe, and I think everybody wants the recipe, but it really does come down to what are the goals of the patient, what are the goals of the interdisciplinary care team, and picking the right measures to be able to pull that information out.
I would agree. I think there's a good point to be made is that there is no one right outcome measure, and you really do need a toolbox. A lot of times I go to these conferences and people come up to me and say, Brian, if you had to just choose one measure, what would it be? And I kind of turn it around. I said, well, if you had to only put 1 foot on everybody from now on, which 1 foot would you do? And I think it really speaks to this should be part of your repertoire. This should be part of your skill set. You have to learn to choose the outcome measures that tell the story best for your individual patient, to really make sure that you're working towards their goals, towards their motivations, that you're choosing a variety of outcome measures that really can help you capture their experience and then pass that along to other rehab professionals, to physicians, to reimbursement agencies, whoever that might be. I mean, the 2-minute walk test is great because it's a kind of a good basic functional measure of endurance. Gives you an idea about capacity. In this particular case, you might be able to use it to decide what kinds of jobs somebody could do. If they needed to walk longer distances in their job, then they might need to work with a therapist to increase their endurance and be able to perform that test a little better. Or it might, have less value than that if they're, sitting like I am in a desk all day. But I think you can learn a lot from these tools, and it is really important to choose the right ones as you do that.
So I think let's go into the top and bottom question here. So kind of what we talked about, is there a recipe for incorporating outcome measures in an orthotics clinic in particular? And we'll just go down the line again. We can start, Jason, at the end again. And
Yeah, sure. So it's not necessarily just separating off into orthotics or prosthetics, in my opinion. I think it's the right outcome measure. And so there are some, population-specific outcome measures that maybe have value in a certain group, or there's maybe measures that are not population-specific. And so we've been talking about the 2-minute walk test, and that's one that's kind of universal for people that are walking, basically, right? So you can use that with people that have suffered a stroke as much as you could use it with folks that are using an artificial limb, or any number of other diagnoses. So as far as in an orthotics clinic, I think you should probably give some thought to some general measures that have utility across diagnostic groups. Those are some of the things that we've tried to do in our outcome measurement profile per patient that we administer on veterans, and right now we're using those in our prosthetic clinic, but due to some other national initiatives, I'll just give you some numbers to give you an example. We care for 85,000 veterans, I told you, in our network. And from the recent wars, we have 1,600 people that have suffered amputation or multiple amputations. But compare that against the 30,000 veterans that we have that have limb trauma and are probably going to use orthotic services, and they don't have an orthotic clinic home within our network. So we've started that. We've put up 6 places around the country. But there is no orthotic system of care within our network. So what we're doing is we're trying to capitalize on the same practitioners that are administering our prosthetic clinic to now have a clinic offering for orthotic clinic. And we're hoping to use many of the same data collection protocols, forms, et cetera. And so getting back to this question, how do you integrate into an orthotic clinic? I think you try to pick some measures that fit the general goals or the general kind of temperature of the type of clinic that you're operating. I would recommend you use them generally that can be applied across diagnostic groups, maybe including your patients that walk with prostheses as well as those that use orthoses. I think if you want to talk about separating and choosing different measures, when you start talking about the upper limb population, that's a different conversation entirely. But with lower limb orthotics and lower limb prosthetics, I think you can probably pick a reasonable measure that doesn't tax the clinician in terms of documentation, administration time, and you'll have some nice data that helps with a lot of different things.
I would just add that I would consider using a patient-reported measure as well as a functional, and then as far as the functional measures go, if you can use that in your assessment. So as Brittany talked about, the POGS or the Edinburgh Visual Gait Score, you can actually use as part of your assessment to say, this person does not have swing phase clearance, and that is going to be a part of my assessment. I need to address that, and then I'm going to add that into my intervention, and then I should be able to reduce that as one of their deviations in my intervention.
Yeah, I would certainly echo Kara's thought about using multiple outcome measures. I think it's always good to choose one from both perspectives, the self-report and kind of the observational or the performance-based assessment. I also like what Jason said too about the kind of the population focus of these measures. It's very often, I think, we think prosthetics, orthotics, and orthotics really is a variety of different disabilities, right, or medical conditions, right? You have stroke, you have CP, and a number of different conditions, and there are measures designed for each one of those. So I think prosthetics, we kind of get off easy sometimes in that it's amputation focused, and so it's one medical condition, one kind of device category that match up there, and I think orthotics becomes much more complicated. But I like his suggestion about trying to find generalized measures, things like the 2-minute walk test, the ABC, things like that you could use that kind of cross disciplines and focus on those constructs or those attributes that are of interest to you, like balance, like mobility, things that that you're trying to affect with your intervention. And I think many times it's just getting into the habits. It's about creating a culture. So even if you just start with these initial measures, and maybe if you don't even use them to the same extent that Brittany's talking about, though that would certainly be the ideal case, but just get in the habit of collecting that information. You get your patients used to it, you get you used to it, and maybe you start to kind of go, oh, this should just be part of what I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think that will have huge value to you and your practices as time goes on.
So we have a lot of questions that have just come in. We got about 5 minutes left, so we're gonna speed around a couple of them. I think some of them we can group together. So there's a bunch on choosing a standard set of outcome measures for clinics, and how do you choose your outcome measures, and how do we make sure we're doing the same things? So choosing an outcome measure is a big question. That was something that we wrestled with absolutely in our clinic, is how do we choose, which one do we use? There are 100 out there. How do we choose one? There's a bunch of different steps to go through. What do you want to measure? Which ones are made to measure that thing in the population you're interested in? Which ones fit into your clinic? And also, like, once we choose them, how maybe I decide to use 5 different ones or 3 different ones than you decide to use. So that's a big question. What I would say is one thing that we've been working on at Barber for the last 1.5 years is developing a tool to help people choose what outcome measures to use. So right now it's really in its infancy of this, but it's something that we're talking about on another talk on Saturday morning. So if you're interested in kind of joining the discussion on how do we choose outcome measures, how do we use them across clinic platforms, how do we collaborate P&O and in different prosthetics and orthotics clinics across the country, I'd encourage you to check that talk out. We've been working with Boundless for the last little bit on kind of going through what it looks like in both the prosthetics and an orthotics clinic and what that can do. But definitely, we need to, in order to do the big data stuff and put our numbers together, we need to be collecting the same outcome measures in the same way, at the same time, on the same populations. And so that's not something that we can just kind of decide right here, like, everybody, let's use this outcome measure and go for it. It's something that I'd say if you're interested in it, come and you can talk to myself, you can talk to other clinics who are doing it, and let's come up with a plan across Canada, or at least a couple different clinics across Canada that are going to commit to using the same outcome measures the same way, and that we can start doing this. And once 1 or 2 clinics join in this, we can much easily kind of grow from there. So that's what I'd say from that. I don't know if you guys have anything to add from the kind of U.S. perspective, I guess.
Yeah, we're doing this in our VA network, and we're trying to mesh the DoD network to some degree, and they don't have to, right? I mean, they're separate agencies. And so we have, and actually lots of folks, just like you mentioned, lots of folks are interested in outcome measures, so there's lots of different committees and organizations that are putting effort into this. We're no different. We have an outcome committee within the VA, and it's interagency. It has DoD representation. But what we've decided at this point is we have a toolbox list of measures that are on the table that we kind of recommend for use, right, from our amputation system of care. And keeping in mind that has in it a subdivision of the emerging orthotic clinics. I can't call it a system of care because that doesn't exist. So there's that toolbox. And the discussion currently in the ASOC leadership is that eventually what will happen is, because we're running a registry in the background and all the VA system will input into this, they will put into this registry. Right now they're putting in sort of socio-demographic type information. Eventually it'll be anthropometric, and down the line it'll be outcomes. So Meantime, we're developing this toolbox list of outcomes that anyone can choose from that we recommend because they're robust and whatever. They have all these attributes that are favorable. So what will happen eventually probably is that within that list, you can have the autonomy to choose from that list or any other measure you want at your site, but you will choose or you will administer a number of outcome measures from that list that will go into that registry. And I think that's the approach down the line that the VA is going to use in the U.S. And you have to think about that as a way to kind of wrangle in lots of different sites across lots of different states, et cetera. And we share that information with our DoD colleagues as well.
I would just add that if you as a population decide that you want to do a handful or maybe a few outcome measures, that is going towards the goal of populating some data for your country, but that doesn't mean that in your assessment of this single individual patient that you have to stop there. You know, you might choose a few, but then if the person's main complaint is that they don't get enough sleep, then that might not go in it might not be identified in the ABC or the 2-minute walk test, but if you do the promise, it will show up in there. So you do have to still, you know, don't stop there. That might be for your country, but this might be for this patient.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I think, you know, we have the goal of trying to create a registry, right, to get, you know, larger data sets and things like that. And I think it's important to have common outcome measures. I don't think we need to have identical outcome measures. I would echo what Kara said, which is, you know, really, you need to customize the outcome measures individualized per your patient. Ideally, we'll have a lot of overlap in those outcome measures and that those numbers will begin to build up. But I don't necessarily think it's ideal if everyone is using exactly the same outcome measures because you don't have exactly the same patients. And I think that's an important point to make, and I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah.
So.
We found that a lot of the outcome measures that we chose, we didn't choose because they're the best outcome measure and they work in every person and they show us everything we want. We chose them because we had to start somewhere. And so it's a journey. We said, okay, we're going to select these ones and we're going to see what happens. And if we do them for 2 years and decide that they don't tell us anything useful and it didn't help our patient care, then we're going to get rid of them and choose another one and experiment that one for a couple of years and see where that goes. So that's all the time we have. I'm getting this flashing red light now. So, but there's lots of great questions still. So I'd encourage you to come to other outcome measures talks, talk to other people about outcome measures, and just get the discussion continuing on for the rest of the week.